No, I don't. There we go. Done. Okay. Oh, am I doing the right thing there? Did I hit the right button? Oh yeah, I did. Good. Excellent. So I'm going to put up some slides and we'll go from there. So just literally one slide, which is a little bit of an intro for people. Where are we? Yay, a first go at this, I think, is kind of the critical thing. I put up some of this on the Emma, but kind of on the left-hand side, a little bit of structure to this. Might relate some news to people, or feel free to chime in if you've got any news about what's going on. And we'll spend a little bit of time on that, and then we'll do some fast five stuff, some summaries of things that we're doing at the moment. And I'd love to hear from a couple of other people if we can do that. And then if we've just got some open Q&A to round it out, that sounds good. I'm sure it will run over the times that I've posted. It's just to kind of give us a little bit of a sense of where we spend our time. Just some rules to remember. Please respect all of the other people on the call. That kind of goes without saying. We'll run the emceeing, and we're pretty happy to let the conversation go, but we'll call time and move on if we have to. Depending on how big this gets, we might end up in the written questions, oral answers category. Be a little bit like Parliament in that context. And last kind of thing is we are very interested in opinions from people who aren't working in the health system, but please consider who the audience is. And I called this open mic, and I kind of went, oh, that's kind of someone's name. So if your name is Mike, please don't be offended. But I think it's a fair thing to say that this is hopefully a safe space for everybody. So that was all I wanted to do in terms of slides. So we're going to stop presenting, and I'm going to talk about a couple of things that I've seen in the last couple of weeks around the internet, which might be of interest to a group like this. And the first thing I want to talk about is something going on in Texas at the moment at a place called Starbase. There's a man called Elon Musk who is doing some work on building rockets to go to Mars. And I'm not one that necessarily believes in his politics or his ethics, but he's certainly done some really interesting things in the technology space. And he's recently posted, he hasn't posted, there's a chap that's posted for him, about 2 hours and 20 minutes of video on YouTube. I'd thoroughly recommend the first hour. The second hour is maybe not so good, and the third one's about 20 minutes. He goes through the talk very much in quite an AMA Reddit style approach, and talks about how they do production at Tesla, and and then how they're doing it at SpaceX in terms of these big rockets they're building. If I look back over the sort of last 12 months, increasingly I've been involved in trying to get a proof of concept completed for COVID, and then turning that proof of concept into a production solution. And so Elon Musk got a really interesting set of insights into which he goes through in a lot of detail about how they do that, particularly at SpaceX, and how they've done that at Tesla. So it's kind of taking a good design and turning it into something you can build thousands and hundreds of thousands of things of. So that is a link I've got here. So the guy that's done the presentation is someone called Everyday Astronaut. So if I paste the link in here, we'll have access to that. Something else that's supposed to be coming up soon, or supposed to be today actually, is the start of the Lightning Lab GovTech. So that's based here in Wellington, and essentially what that is, it's run by Creative HQ. So some of you might have heard of them. They're a creative and digital and innovation agency here in Wellington, and they do work with government agencies that want to do innovation. So you can go to GovTech Lightning Lab and kind of see what they've done in past years. And if you needed a partner or someone to help you do some innovation, they're available here in Wellington. So it might not be useful to everybody, but it's an interesting program. And last night was supposed to be the opening evening for that program. So they go out, get I think 50,000 from an organisation to run a 12-week program to come up with a product, basically, or product or a solution. So they're in the market and they do that work. Something we've just signed up again for this year as a team is something that is called Summer of Tech. So some of you will know about this, some of you won't. Summer of Tech is a graduate and intern program, and so they run like a recruitment model, which is quite interesting. We've had interns the last 2 years where they run over summer, so they start kind of early December and finish in mid to late January. One of our interns from last year, Harry, finished with us on his intern program and joined the CVIT program, so that's the COVID vaccination program here at the ministry as a designer. So he's recently just finished with us after 6 months and has gone to finish his degree at Massey. So turns out there's some really good students and smart students out there, and Summer of Tech also is focused, I think, on Auckland this year as well, but we tend to get applications from around the country. So there's something there. Another thing that's coming up is we've got a job advertised at the moment with us which is advertised as a principal advisor. So if you're interested in that, feel free to put in an application. The application process for the ministry is on our website. And we're about to hire someone who will be an equity lead. So we've gone through a process for that, and that person's job is going to be taking a lead on Māori data sovereignty for data and digital at the ministry. So it'll be useful for us, I think, and probably we will be using them more widely in the context of the equity plan we've developed. So we're interested in not just the data sovereignty component to it, but we're also interested in how we develop the skills and experience of our staff in Te Tiriti. We're also interested in what our co-design, co-production model might be. So we're working on that, and that'll come as part of the header program. And then the third one is probably connected to the Māori data sovereignty stuff. It's looking at our governance and how we might establish enduring and ongoing relationships with iwi. So that's probably the news from me. Mary, have you got anything that you want people to know about what's come out in the last couple of weeks and what's coming up?
The main thing for me will be that we've finished off our digital consent workshops, and so in the next week or so we'll be sending out the final summary of workshop 3 to all the participants, and I see that some on the call have been part of that, so yeah, thank you very much for your input, and yeah, we'll get those final details out to you pretty soon. Cheers.
Very good. So that's about it in terms of the news section, unless someone has a burning piece of news they want to relate. Oh, actually, I know what I was going to talk about. There's a website called memia.com. So it's run by a guy called Ben Reid in Christchurch. So he sends out a newsletter, I think every week, with a bunch of things coming up, and it's pretty wide ranging. It's very much not a health thing, but it comes from kind of quite a wide angle of what's happening in technology. So an interesting read, and can widen your knowledge about what's coming up in technology in the ether. So what we might do is just kick off a few 5-minute fast fives, and so I'll go first and talk about a proof of concept we've run for vaccine certificates. So we've recently completed a proof of concept for vaccine certificates, and that was with a company called Matter, who are based in Auckland. Some of you might have heard of them. The whole purpose of that was to understand for us just what a vaccine certificate could be, should be, would be. And in this, it's interesting because there's a lot of competing standards. So we're familiar with standards that have come from the US. So there's smart health cards. There's a standard that's come out of the EU called the EU DCC. So all of the 31 EU countries are currently producing certificates that are compliant with that, and the NHS is producing compliant certificates there. And then there's the ICAO VDS, or the Visible Digital Seal, and that work's really interesting because it's quite a change. So historically, we had a little yellow book. That little yellow book was in part for yellow fever, but for also other vaccinations that you might take around the country or around the world. So we've seen probably in the last 3 to 6 months lots of cases where fake vaccination certificates are circulating, and so we started working through how do you minimize that risk, and we've come across, and most of these comply with something called a verifiable credential. So essentially it takes information from a system, signs it as a QR code, and so that you know, because you use similar encryption to e-passports, that there's that the information in the QR code can be trusted. So they can be printed out as a PDF, they can be held in a Google or Apple wallet, and essentially what we did was, with our proof of concept, compare how the different kind of standards created a QR code, because it was quite interesting. So we're busy talking to a bunch of passport people, a bunch of border people who are very obsessed with security. And from a health perspective, particularly in the Ministry of Health, we don't have track record with something called PKI, which is public key infrastructure, which I've learned a lot about recently, and is a little bit esoteric, but in summary, it's the little padlock in your browser bar, which you have when you go and do online shopping. So people talk about web certificates, and essentially what we're doing is co-opting web certificates to do this. So funnily enough, it comes down to how do you encode the package of data, and how do you make that as small as possible, because obviously the smaller you make it, the smaller the QR code. And so the smaller the QR code, the easier it is to print on pieces of paper, the easier it is to put on a phone screen, and therefore the easier it is for other people to scan. Now, it's funny because where we started was this thought that, you know, people go to an airport and they show their QR code to say that they've been vaccinated, and it turns out that's not how it works at all. So as we started to go through the proof of concept, we were talking to customs quite a lot about it. So they've got a real interest, and they're taking a lead on the people coming in. And they said, oh, why would we want to scan people when they arrive in the airport? Oh, well, wouldn't you want to know? Oh, no, they'd have to do it before they arrive. They'd have to do it before they arrive because there's a real concern that if you leave it until the person arrives in New Zealand, so we don't have border forces at the far end, if the person arrived, it turned out that their vaccine passport was fake. The first you know about it is when they're standing in I think they call it the A line or the AQ. And so the question they had was, so if we find a fake vaccine certificate and the first time we find is when they're standing at our passport line, what do we do? And I'm kind of like, oh, well, there's a good chance they might have COVID if they're coming from somewhere else in the world. So imagine the first thing you know is when someone's standing in front of the passport officer, turns out has the vaccine certificate that's not real, and they might have COVID. You need to stop all the planes coming in. This is according to customs. Stop all the planes coming in, empty the hall of all of the people, put them all in MIQ, and then you need to give it a clean before you can start the planes coming again. So it's really interesting when you start talking to the people that have to operationalize some of these things, just how complicated the process needs to be. And so we started talking about, okay, well, how quickly could you take a vaccine certificate? And so we started thinking about, well, it might be 6 weeks. 6 weeks before you travel is the average time for booking. But of course, you might need a 72-hour test certificate as well. So you have to make a declaration 6 weeks ahead of travel, and then you have to come back at the 72-hour mark to give us a test certificate. So you can start to see some of the complexity that we started to tease out. It was really good to get it done, because it feels like often we're ending up in a procurement situation where we're trying to buy things and we don't really understand what those things are. So it was really good to get that proof of concept finished, and we'll try and get the outcome up on our Yammer site once I've typed it up. So there's one 5-minute conversation. Anya, did you have anything you wanted to talk about for 5 minutes? You're kind of on my screen, so I can see you there.
I hadn't planned. I was supposed to be skiing today, but so I'm not quite in the right headspace. Just so we're at Via Innovations down at Canterbury District Health Board, and just a couple of things we're working on at the moment is our completing our first spin out, I guess, which is a vital signs simulation system, and so that's quite exciting for Via Innovations and New Zealand Health Innovation Hub, because that's sort of setting that model of commercialisation. And then other things we're really just working on at the moment is working up our schedule of events and competitions for the year. presuming we're all going to be able to get together around tables and meeting rooms again in the not too distant future. And yeah, in due course, we're happy to share those, because some we look to do with industry as well as internal processes. But that's really what we're focused on at the moment.
Very good, very good. Did anyone else have a 5-minute share that they wanted to make with the group? Do you want to either come off mute or put your hand up, one of the two? Eileen was going to, but she's got a sore throat still. I don't think she's got COVID, so she didn't tell me she's got COVID. So
I can offer an update.
Yeah, sure.
5 minutes. Yeah, maybe less.
No, that's all right. That's all right.
So I'm Parag from ADHB, product owner for RPA. So RPA is robotic process automation. So putting in software bots and trying to automate highly repetitive, mundane processes. So yeah, we're working with a variety of use cases. A lot of our bots that we're seeing is just trying to take some data from one system and put it into another that otherwise would be data entry. But I think some of the cool ones we're doing is, so we're looking at putting a bot between online outpatient booking, an outpatient booking system. So you've got a web front, and then going and updating a legacy outpatient booking system that nobody wants to leave behind. So a bot will literally take these outpatient bookings that the patient has completed and go and update, and likewise on the round trip, take the capacity from the outpatient system and then go and update the web front. So we always have sort of at least a live sort of view of what our capacity is in terms of the outpatient slots. Another one we've got an intern to build is called Check TLS. So currently any external email that our lab sent to needs to be checked that it complies with the email security like TLS and other security protocols. So someone actually manually does that at the moment. So we've built a bot that will actually go to a site, take that email or email domain and check it. And if it doesn't comply, then update a spreadsheet or update some sort of system, maybe a data warehouse where this is housed. Another one we're working with is HR, so your standard APC annual practicing certificates. So someone currently goes and manually checks these external websites, takes the clinician registration number, and then goes and checks these are valid. This needs to be done routinely. So we're going to have a bot doing that. Another one, which I think is pretty cool, is patient blood results. So currently, clinicians receive a heap of blood results, whether they're abnormal or normal. And often they don't check them because there's so many. So we're going to have a bot which helps route just the abnormal ones. And then if they're abnormal, then say, okay, these are the set of blood tests that they actually need to get, subsequent blood tests they need to get depending on the type of surgery that they're getting. So helping put a bot in between what is manual ordering of blood results. Yeah, those are the ones I think are the cool ones. There's a lot of other ones, but they're more sort of data entry, moving data between systems, which is very routine. Yeah. Yeah, happy to answer any questions.
Well, so I can see a hand up from Saxon. He's got a question, and I can guarantee it's a clinical question.
You're right there, John. Parag, that sounds really interesting. Boy, that's a big step with the blood tests. You know, like a normal can be important. So you're saying that clinicians no longer look at the normal. Sometimes that will be a trigger to prompt the next step. How are you going to audit that that's okay and there's not clinical misses? What's the governance around that?
Sorry,
and
so
also I'm interested in whether you think that creates laziness in that there's no kind of negative feedback loop of over ordering tests because you know you never have to check them.
Sure. No, these are good questions. So the approach we're taking is obviously co-design. We have clinical governance over this. It is very much in the discovery stage. So we're saying, can a bot do this? If it can, what can it do? So to answer your questions, we're not hiding the normal results. We will be still showing them to a clinician, but what's happening right now is if a clinician's given 100 results and they don't check them, that's a big miss. So what we're saying is, here's the ones you definitely need to check, the abnormals, and then, you know, around your decision support, check the normal ones as well. But the bot will basically highlight the ones that need to be prioritized and routed to the right clinicians.
It's an interesting problem statement. So the late Peter Hicks and I did a lot of work in Capital and Coast in this space probably 10 years ago, because it is a behavior thing, I think, is kind of an interesting thing. And so we tried to work through whether there was technology that would fix this problem, and particularly where it kind of came from was often a house surgeon would be doing a cover shift. So they'd be covering someone else's team, and they'd order a bunch of bloods, and it goes back to the ordering clinician. And so there's kind of this accountability problem that you end up with when someone's doing a cover shift, and it's where does the result go, and how do you know how important that result is to the person? The technology solution was, how do we try and keep up with who's doing cover shifts? And it turned out that was really, really hard. So what the answer in Capital and Coast ended up being, at least when I left, was basically a kind of a competitive chart at the end of the day, I suppose. Right. So at the end of the week, the CMO at the time, Jeff Robinson, got a chart which showed for each clinical specialty how many lab results were not signed off. And so it was the clinical leader's responsibility for not being the worst in the organisation. And you'd be surprised how competition like that kind of drives performance, especially when it's kind of amongst your peers. So as far as I can tell, I think that's still working in Capital and Coast, although I had a funny conversation with someone maybe about a couple of months ago where they say, you know, periodically when the hospital gets really busy, it gets worse and then it gets better again because people start to see it coming through in the numbers. So it's a good idea, Parag. And I think the reality is we could be using bots so much more. Do you know what I mean? Like it's not a sophisticated piece of technology necessarily, but it could be quite handy with lots of the legacy we have around. Does someone else have a 5-minute conversation they want to have? A fast 5 is what I called it in my slides. I thought that was quite clever, but maybe not so. Well, I can share another one. So we've recently just completed a project using data from Auckland District Health Board. So Microsoft talked to us about a new product they've got coming out soon, or in fact, I think it's just come into GA. It's called Text Analytics for Health. So Text Analytics for Health is an Azure machine learning service, and so we worked with Ali in Auckland, Ali Khan in Auckland DHB to get some radiology reports, and Anthony Doyle, who's the clinical leader for clinical director for radiology, does some part-time work at the Ministry of Health, to look if we can to see if we could break down those written reports into their kind of constituent components. So, you know, what was the report of? Was it normal, abnormal? What were the reasons? What were additional findings? All of those types of things. Because it turns out when we started drilling into the problem, the RIS holds the reason for referral. And often it's a little bit like, you know, in a hospital, this is a common problem where someone gets referred by the GP probably, and the GP does their best guess of what I think is wrong with the person. And so, you know, if the pain's coming from the stomach, they go to SACS. If it's coming from the head, they'll go to the neurologist. But it might turn out that the pain from the stomach's coming from the head, or the pain in the head's coming from the stomach. So it gets into the hospital and ends up maybe going to 2 or 3 people before someone says, actually, I think this is for me. And so the RIS is similar in the sense that, you know, it appears you've got a sore leg. It turns out that sore leg is back pain, so the person gets a CT spine rather than getting a knee X-ray. So in that, Microsoft offered to help us do some work in terms of using that new service. So we've got I've got an Azure tenancy run by the ministry. So we let Microsoft write some code in there to parse that data, and the outcomes are fair, I would say. So I wouldn't say they're great. One of the cool things is, particularly with machine learning, is it's often hard to know how good the answer is you're getting. So what their standard outputs are from the product are not just what it tells you what it is, but it also tells you kind of a weighting about how accurate it thinks it is. So kind of an R squared type value. The interesting thing, I think, and probably what we saw is, despite Anthony's kind of protestations, the reporting's quite heterogeneous. So heterogeneous, probably a better way to say it, whereby, you know, depending on who the radiologist is and the reason that they're reporting the radiology, the reports aren't that standardized. So there was plenty of work that was having to be done to try and standardize all of the components of the report. So, you know, if it was a CT scan, it's likely to have these components in it, versus if it's an MRI, it's going to have these components in the report. So we're looking to see what we can do with that next. We didn't get that many through the process, but happy to share with anybody if you want to see what we did and kind of take it from there. One of the interesting questions that's been raised with me, so there's a chap in the cancer agency called John Fountain, who's in charge of the cancer reporting stuff. Something that's come up, and particularly there's a lot of work going on at Precision Driven Health at the moment in this space, is something called negation. So quick tour around negation is when you have a machine learning algorithm and it's parsing words, such as a diagnosis, it might find a diagnosis that says cardiovascular disease. So it picks those words out and says this person has cardiovascular disease and here's the likelihood they have it. Now the problem comes when there might be 1, 2, or 3 words in front of that, or even 4, which says not cardiovascular disease, is not cardiovascular disease, does not have cardiovascular disease. So that ability for it to determine whether it's in the positive intent or in the negation or the negative intent, i.e. you don't have it, is something that lots of machine learning algorithms and services really struggle with. So we didn't really get into the weeds of that with Microsoft service, although I note on their website they say you need to be really careful with that as a problem statement. So it's easy to find the words and to interpret the words, but that question of whether those words mean you have a thing or whether you don't have a thing is kind of still critical. And like I said, Kevin Ross's lot have been doing quite a bit in this space with Waimata ADHB. So very good. Excellent. So has anyone else got a fast 5 they want to talk about?
I'll go for it, John.
Okay, Noel, you tell us what you've been working on.
Okay, I guess I don't think I know everybody on this call, so just a really quick introduction of who I am. So I'm Noel Pagao. I'm the account manager for a medical publisher, Elsevier. So I guess most people that have gone through a medical or nursing education might know of us in terms of the latest scientific literature. But how does this relate to digital health? Basically, we use various technologies to contextualize the latest evidence-based content into clinical and patient workflow. So I guess just using a bit of an example, a GP that was recently quoted in NZ Doctor in terms of the top 5 technologies that he's using is our 3-dimensional digital anatomy product called Complete Anatomy. And so he's using Complete Anatomy in his patient consultations to basically describe and interact with his patient around the nature of their disease or condition. There's also latest guidance and evidence associated in terms of the ongoing treatments and exercises, what have you. So that's a nice little success story. And other forms of evidence-based clinical decision support can either be used as a reference. Matthew Valentine had even brought it up in a seminar not too long ago about pull and push based CDS. And I guess the pull CDS is, I'm a clinician, I've got a question, and where do I go to in terms of the various sources of information. Now we do find that even to this day we're in most of the DHBs, but it's difficult to find that information, and people are still going out to Google to find information. And so, go out to a trusted publisher, whether that's us or some of the others, and and it might require a fair bit of going into your library or internet. We're trying to advocate, trying to make this kind of information quicker and easier, whether that's from a patient portal or in terms of diagnostic information. That might be something along the lines of from the RIS or from the LIS, but effectively, as a publisher of scientific literature, we're trying to make all of that latest evidence much easier to access, whether in clinical workflow and patient workflow. How's that, John?
Thanks, Noel. That was good. Hey, and I've just seen someone else pop up on my screen here, Brett, who's working with us at the moment as well. Hey, Brett, why don't you give us 5 minutes on your iwi affiliation project you're working on? No slides, mind. That's the rules. And you need to unmute yourself before you start too.
I've been just on a meeting with them, with the design team, which is why I'm a little bit late. We've been having a few little final challenges to get our website up and running. So we're about to kick off a new collection for descent and iwi affiliation, which has been attempted a number of times in the past with varying degrees of success. Our focus obviously is for health, but also to be able to provide that data back to iwi for them to use themselves, which is where the richest sources in terms of particularly around numbers, demographics, and then when you start overlaying other things like geography, geographic data, and then different types of sicknesses, things like diabetes, etc., it actually starts to become a really powerful data set. So whilst I'm not really 100% sure why it's been such a difficult thing in the past, I think I have an idea, but we won't go down there. And but I think we're on a successful path this time. It's going to be, or hopefully we'll get it out once we get it up and running and set up. Basically, put it back in the hands of iwi, of Māori themselves, to get the data and keep the data linked through other health systems like the National Enrolment System, immunisation systems, etc. So we're able to give rich sets of data, not just to Māori, but back to the health sector to use as well. So interesting challenge. We've got educations involved, TBKs involved, stats obviously, and health. And there's a real strong desire to get this up and running and working well. Interestingly, there's a number of other agencies that are also either collecting iwi data or looking to collect iwi data, and so everyone seems to have an interest in it, which makes it even more interesting from our perspective.
That's great. How are you planning on getting the data, Brett? Like, what's the mechanism? Why now, and what's the mechanism?
Oh, why now? Well, COVID. So along came COVID, and along came immunisation, and it was the immunisation process. Call it that. I think that's the easiest thing. Is presented an opportunity to gather additional data other than that around specific vaccinations, and iwi data, iwi against vaccinations or with vaccination data would be huge. Unfortunately, we're sort of halfway through before we're getting the collection up and running. However, we're still taking advantage of that, using a link on the booking system and then at vaccination sites themselves. So we see that as the first step in our collection process, getting into it, and then we'll build it out into other systems such as the National Enrolment System, The digital identity, I don't know if you've talked about that, John, but there's a big, significant push within health around digital identity. Enter once, use many, and the HITA program, which is basically putting a service layer across all of the data so that you can get health data on people from pretty much wherever you are in the system.
That sounds really good. And so that's getting ready to go live, and it'll continue to exist beyond COVID, I think, is kind of the key point. So it's something that we've never had really before, and so it's a new service that we'll be able to add to people, maybe if they needed to enrol their patients at the general practice, or they needed to check people's details when they turn up to the emergency department, or they wanted to book an outpatient appointment, Parag maybe. So there's lots of places where pointing them in the direction of, can you tell us your iwi and your whakapapa, there might be some really good opportunities there. I think, Brett, remind me the numbers. So we tend to assume, the NHI has ethnicity in it. What's the difference in the ethnicity data in the NHI versus what we think is probably real?
I think it's about just under 75%. We think ethnicity is correct, and then that crosses over with the IDI data, which is a little bit better by 1 or 2%, and also slightly different. The crossover isn't sort of 1 for 1, but 75% is really nowhere near enough. And we've seen in previous census that the shortfall in that data has some fairly dramatic effects, actually, from a Māori perspective, from an iwi perspective, and from a regional perspective when it comes to Māori in terms of services, where services are pointed, where money is pointed, etc., funding. So it'll be a pretty important thing. I think the really interesting thing that's come out of this, and we've done over the last year, we've done a lot of work in co-creation with Māori, with Te Arawa, with Ngāti Toa, and with some other iwi. Whilst we were heading down the track of collecting iwi data for health purposes and to provide the data back to iwi, what's come out strongest from the people who've participated in the co-design has been connecting and reconnecting with their whakapapa. So it's actually that is the key driver, and that'll be the key motivator for people to actually participate in providing that data. As we know, the biggest barrier we face is trust, particularly with Māori and Pacifica. So this coming from a different angle of not just collecting data to do research and what have you, more in an area where we're talking about whakapapa and being able to understand where you're from and where you're whakapapa to, and we think will increase the uptake significantly, and yet still give us what we need to do the research and for iwi to be able to use that data themselves.
Cool, excellent. What we might do now is a little bit of Q&A. So I said we'd do some news, and then I said we'd do some fast fives, which we've done a few of, and then I said we'd do some Q&A. Does anyone have any questions? I suppose first time for everyone to ask questions. Anyone want to have a conversation about anything? Any problems you have? Any opportunities you can think of? Something that's come up in the last week, so some of you might know someone called Rill Jensen. So Rill is now the acting CEO for NZHIT. So she and I had a conversation the other week, and it was a conversation kind of as a bit of a follow-up to the NZHIT report, where NZHIT had identified, the need for more innovation in the health system. So we're about to start some work to put together a plan for when Health NZ comes online. So we've talked to some people, but if you have any thoughts about how we could be doing innovation differently in the health system, either you can speak up now, you can email me later, and we can make sure that kind of gets fed into the process. But one of the conversations that came up with RIL was kind of this procurement conversation. So we do quite a lot of technology procurement at the ministry, and there's kind of, and I spent 4 years in the private sector, and I've now been at the ministry for about 3.5, and been involved in a number of procurements, and certainly something she thought would be really good for NZHIT members was to talk about procurement and to talk about the process of buying things from a health sector perspective. Eileen's recently been at a procurement
NZRise.
NZRise workshop to talk about procurement as well. And I think the interesting thing, the observation I'd make is, it seems to me that we often forget that the reason we're buying things or we're coming out to buy things is because we either don't have it or we don't know how to do it. And so in that, that's one part of the problem. I'm currently in a conversation where people want to go and buy something without a budget. It tends to be a problem as well. So they've written in their RFP, wanted to put the RFP on Gets, and I asked them where the budget was, and they said we don't have one, but we wanted to know how much it would cost before we go and ask for a budget, which doesn't seem like a very logical idea. And then there's another interesting situation around procurement where we tend to not use kind of the terminology in probably in a useful way, and tend to call things requests for proposals when really what we want is a quote, because we know what we want to buy, and then we tend not to use RFIs when we don't know what's in the market. We tend to issue RFPs, and so there's a lot of terminology in there, and it's funny because I know there are a number of procurements, particularly in the health system, where we treat the procurement people a little bit like sometimes we treat the lawyers. So the lawyers, in my opinion, I know we're recording this, so I'll be careful, but the lawyers expect to be asked an opinion. So they expect to be asked and give an opinion. They don't expect to make decisions, and that's not their job. And it's interesting because I think often we put procurement people in a position where they're almost having to try and make the decision for us, rather than accepting the fact that they're giving us advice and we may choose or may choose not to follow it. And the reason is the procurement person often doesn't understand the strategic priorities of the organisation. They might not understand what you're trying to achieve with what you're trying to buy. And so in procurement, I think we've got a really good system running here in the ministry particularly around technology, where we're pretty comfortable about the role procurement plays, which is giving us good advice, not making our decisions for us. So I know Brett's kind of had a good experience recently. We've had a good experience in terms of our certificates management, but it'd be useful to kind of talk a bit more widely about that. And so I committed to RIL that we'd be doing that in an NZHIT meeting coming up. So I think there's probably a health system side of that conversation as well, like what does good procurement of technology look like, so that we're not pissing off the people that we're trying to get services from. So maybe that's something to come. Does anyone have any questions that I can ask yet, or have I just been talking into a bit of a vacuum? Noel, you've got a question?
Yes, John. So thanks for kicking that off. And so around procurement, will there be a published set of priorities at some point in time?
Do you mean of things to buy?
There's
or how to
a
buy
vast
things,
range of technologies out there, of course.
Yeah, it's a good question.
Well, I suppose, will there be a set of priorities that us as vendors will have a sense of then, in terms of the queue of different investments? At what point, should we be engaged? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's hard. So, and I can relate to you why. So the reason it's hard is we get a phone call on a Monday from a minister that says, I want to solve this problem, and I need a plan by the end of the week. And so basically there's a mad scramble then to try and find the money from somewhere to go and buy a thing that someone's decided is now important. So that's quite an unplanned model, and we try to avoid that as much as we can, but we kind of end up in that situation on a regular basis. The other thing is, I think you'll probably see quite a bit come out around when HEDA is published about what we think are the first priorities, and I think the sad thing about that is lots of the priorities are the basics. So we need to try and get the basics in place And we all know this because of historic underinvestment in technology in the health system, rather than an unwillingness to do things. But something that's kind of probably a good place to keep an eye on will be through our website. So obviously we put stuff up on our website ourselves, and we put things up on our Yammer as well. And so through there, you'll probably keep a good eye on the direction we're taking. The big problem we've had is just how busy it's been in the last 18 months. So there's been a lot of unplanned stuff, and I have to admit it's not really a politician's fault that COVID keeps changing. It tends to be COVID's fault. I think be good for us to be more kind of forward-looking, but challenge the whole health system to be a bit more forward-looking as well. So that being said, it's pretty obvious what our priorities are as a health system. It's change in terms of the organisational structure, but also change in terms of sustainability and change in terms of equity. So those are pretty much the priorities as they stand, and that's all on DPMC's website. So inside that, there's interesting questions about where that goes. We're not short of listening to good ideas, so we're happy to listen to good ideas. Sax, I can see you've got a question, or you want to start a conversation about something.
It's just a reflection on some of these procurements. Seems to me in the tech space, when people describe to me as a clinician what interoperability is, they say it's got to be everyone's got to have the same plug to plug into, but we don't seem to have that written, hard baked into the contracts. We still seem to be surfacing up different bits of tech that don't plug into our wall. They've been bought for the American market or whatever it is. But the other bit, I think, is there doesn't seem to be a standard way of procuring, in that the CapEx costs are divorced from the OpEx costs. So people put in for the CapEx and there's no OpEx that follows it. And then we're stuck with something that's half finished, doesn't update, doesn't upgrade, and gradually just becomes worse and worse over a relatively short period of time. And to me, this would seem across New Zealand there should be a standard way of doing this. Why do we make the same mistakes every time?
Totally agree. The interesting answer to that is that's how the accountants like it. The standard accounting rules for what you're allowed to bill to capital versus bill to OpEx, and there's a little bit of probably our own fault in this as a health system, where it's often easier to get capital than it is to get operating money. Few kind of problems and answers in the conversation around kind of the move to cloud services. It's all OpEx, not CapEx, and so there's some recent stuff come out from PwC in Australia about kind of the accounting rules needing to change to account for software as a service or cloud service offerings, where there's much less capital outlay. Funnily enough, Treasury hasn't really kind of updated any of their guidance at the moment yet, and so this is a conversation that's going on, particularly for HEDA at the moment. How much needs to be capital versus how much needs to be operating costs, because Treasury doesn't really know. So it's not like we're building a bridge or buying an aeroplane or whatever it happens to be. So I see your point, Sax, and maybe the last observation I'd make is traditionally we've delivered lots of our projects in waterfall. So you spend a lot of money before you get to the point where you know whether you're solving the problem. And in that, when you realise you're not solving the problem 18 months down the track, you then have to scramble and spend a bunch of money that you were going to spend on the products, on change management, spending it on the product. So you kind of end up in this cycle of spending your money on the wrong things. So I'd say in the context of what we've learned in the last 18 months, it's try and work to an MVP model and a more agile model, because that kind of unlocks the value a lot faster. So I think I said, before anyone else started, I said to Sax, we know already that by sending personalised invites to people to get vaccinated, we've boosted vaccination attendance rates by 7%. So we know that. We didn't have to wait 18 months to build a software solution to find that out. We know that off the bat. Also, we built, so some of you will have seen on Stuff, we now have a letter generation tool where you can get a letter that says what you've been vaccinated with, separate to the little purple card. It was on Stuff last week, kind of 24 hours after we published it. And that took it from 30 minutes of manual labour to 15 seconds for someone to be able to push a button to issue a letter. So you can start to see how quickly you can realise value if you've got kind of the right components and the ability to make changes on the fly. Right, Inga, I can see you've got your hand up. Do you want to either ask a question or start a conversation? We've got 9 minutes left. So.
Oh, okay, very short
question. Or you can answer the answer.
No, I haven't got the answer for this one. With cross government, or the fact that health exists not in a bubble, not in isolation. So with telecommunication infrastructure, with rural coverage of for telehealth, for example, would you like to
subject?
Yeah, would you like to give some comments on how we can progress this further, or how the ministry is progressing the infrastructure for comms across the country?
Yeah, my view is there's a company called Starlink, and that might be an interesting starter for 10 to have a look at how good that is. It's in beta at the moment. And for those of you that kind of started the call, you weren't right here at the start, Inga, there's a set of YouTube videos where Elon Musk is talking about kind of how he goes about his business. Fascinating videos. They're on YouTube and they're at the top of the chat. It's about 2 hours and 20 minutes of content, and he gets right in the weeds. But I think we're always going to have a situation where it's going to be really hard to reach everybody, but just because of the geography of the country. Fundamentally, I don't think we control RSPs, so that's retail service providers, or MB and the investment in the rural RBI2 and UFB investment. So I think there's an opportunity for us to influence, but I don't think there's a lot of control there. I know, Eileen, you want to say something?
I was just going to add that there is a digital inclusion cross-agency group which MB do sit on side, and it's a constant debate from questions raised from health, MSD, and education in particularly around connectivity and coverage. They do have a program of rollout, but I'm not sure. I think it's rolling out to 2023, but it still won't reach 100% coverage. No, and I suppose this is why I'd mentioned Starlink. So Starlink, I think it costs $700 to sign up, and that gets you the dish, and it gives you 100 megabits down, 100 megabits down, not megabytes down, and 100 megabits up. And the latency is pretty good, sub 100 millisecond latency. So if you had someone that plays, Among Us on the home Wi-Fi, then that should be okay. So I think it's $100 a month for all you can eat.
I think it's $150 a month and $750 setup cost, I think.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So that's pretty good.
Anyone can jump on. So
yeah. So
all you need to be able to do
is point it at the sky. So
no, I was just wondering, with the emphasis on inequity and digital as tools for enabling health into the future. Yeah. It's, as you say, we haven't got control over the connectivity, but we're actually critically dependent on it.
Yeah, totally. I suppose the other observation I'd make is it's not like we're going to have less connectivity in the future. I think we're always going to have more. So and there's a little bit of chicken and egg in this as well. So if we all sit around waiting for the connectivity, everyone's going to ask why we need to build it. But if we're pushing the needs of using it, so if we're pushing the use of it, then presumably that then drives the need to make it available. So that's partly what this conversation's about. So
so I think if we had some stats around where we're driving telehealth services, particularly in the short term, that would be really good evidence to take to MB to go, this is where services are being driven. How do we join those two programs up, or at least align them?
Yeah, good idea, Eileen. Sorry, Eileen's got a sore throat, so she's having to stand in the background there a little bit. Does anyone else have any other questions? Alistair, I can see you've got your hand up, but you've got your picture turned off.
Here I am. Can you hear me right?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. I was just going to look back to that procurement conversation just briefly, and putting both my hats on. One of the things that I've seen is this disconnect between the RFP process and really coming back to what's the problem to solve.
Yeah.
And I guess that's, when you've had these 20 disparate organisations all trying to solve the same problem but not really talking to each other, that's produced quite a mishmash of very similar RFPs, but all slightly different in their presentation and with the nuance of that clinical governance around what is actually the problem to solve. Do you see with a more of a single, and again, this is crystal balling because some of the details are yet to be announced, but with a more of a single procurement owner with Health NZ, do you think there's going to be more of a potential paternalistic governance model coming back down to say, look, this problem has been solved in other ways or with solutions already, rather than sort of rinse repeating the RFP process at the locality or even RHA level?
Yeah, it's a good question, Alistair. I think really what I would say is there's a little bit of so we have to take lessons from history. So the lessons from history is when we had the IT Health Board, we bought a bunch of one solution or single solutions for the entire health sector. What that meant was, and New Zealand's quite different to parts of Europe in this, but what that meant was we either had people leave the market because they lost that single contract the health system offered, and so the next time the health system goes to market, there is only one supplier. And that's really different to somewhere like Ireland. So I spent 4 years in Ireland, and it was easy for them to come across and make a bid on a solution in terms of being able to come back into the country and set up an office and all of that sort of support staff and all that sort of stuff. That was much easier in that context, and it's much harder here. The other thing I would say is one contract can mean the difference between existence in a market and exiting a market. So if you have 20, and this is probably not doing ourselves any favours in terms of price, but if you have 20 contracts and you lose one, you've still got 19 contracts. So that's kind of there's an interesting question about, there's got to be some sort of balance between having to do things 20 times versus doing things once, because I can see doing things 20 times has problems, but I can also see that doing everything once has a problem too, at least in those two examples. Especially if we end up in a situation where the choices we're making are for solutions, as Zach said, where the solutions were built in the US and don't necessarily suit our requirements. So there's,
I guess
does that help?
The question, sort of. I guess the question again, with both sides of the table hat on, is more that not so much restricting that opportunity for choice, but at least shrinking the wasted time of clinicians who are time poor and often have little ability to understand what they're being asked to evaluate. And also the wasted time of BAs and project managers and the like, and going through that process often with a wasted endpoint. So I guess that's I'm certainly not saying remove competition, but streamline the process so that you're presenting something that may have even been done 6 months ago, and yet those vendors are having to come back again and redo things which are tweaked only a little bit, but that time suck on for all stakeholders is really large. Totally. So I get your point. I think suffice to say, I don't think there's an easy answer with some of these things, otherwise we might have already fixed it, but certainly we should be heading in the right direction, not the wrong direction, which says to me, how do we put less effort into getting the right answers? So that's us. That's 4 o'clock. So thanks a lot for coming along, everybody. I appreciate your time and appreciate you contributing, and we'll do this again in 2 weeks. Feel free to send me any feedback you have about more of this, less of that, and in the meantime, if you wanted to give us 5 minutes of what you've been working on, we're happy to hear. Thanks a lot. Cheers.
Thank you.